By the time the tornado sirens actually went off, 14-year-old Dawson Pruitt had already been in the storm's cellar for 6 minutes, sitting on an overturned bucket in the dark with a flashlight, the family dog, and 3 cases of bottled water he'd hauled down there himself 2 days earlier, while his own father was still upstairs telling his mother the whole thing was probably going to blow right past them, same as the last 4 warnings that spring. Dawson wasn't in the cellar because anyone told him to be. He was down there because he'd stopped believing his father's read on the weather 2 weeks earlier, and he hadn't told anyone why. If quiet conviction and the wisdom hidden in paying close attention means something to you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. The Pruitt farm sat in the flat, exposed country of central Oklahoma, Tornado Alley in the truest sense, ground that had watched storms roll through nearly every spring for as long as anyone in the family could remember. The Pruitts had farmed there for 3 generations, running about 400 acres of wheat and cattle, and like most families in that stretch of the state, they'd developed a particular, practiced relationship with severe weather warnings. Respectful of them in theory, but worn down enough by years of false alarms that most warnings got treated, in practice, as background noise rather than genuine emergencies. Dawson's father, Cole Pruitt, had lived through enough overhyped storms that fizzled into nothing more than a hard rain to develop what Dawson had started privately calling, that spring, a dangerous kind of confidence. Not recklessness exactly, but a settled certainty that he could read a storm's actual threat level by feel, by the color of the sky and the way the wind was moving, better than any warning system could tell him. Dawson's mother, Renata, mostly deferred to Cole's judgment on weather calls, the same way she deferred to his judgment on most practical farm matters, though she kept a battery radio charged in the kitchen out of a habit her own mother had drilled into her. Dawson had one older sister, Kayla, 17, who was mostly indifferent to weather warnings the way most teenagers were indifferent to things that hadn't personally inconvenienced them yet, and one younger brother, Milo, 8, who took his cues almost entirely from Dawson rather than either parent, watching his older brother's reactions to figure out how worried he was actually supposed to be about anything. It was Dawson's great-uncle Ferris, 82, technically his grandmother's brother rather than a direct relative, who'd first given Dawson a genuinely different way of thinking about storm warnings 2 years earlier. Ferris had survived the devastating 1999 Bridge Creek Moore tornado, one of the most powerful ever recorded, an experience that had left him with a permanent, deeply serious respect for severe weather that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hard-earned understanding. He lived alone in town now, in a small house with a properly stocked storm shelter, and Dawson had spent a good chunk of the past 2 years visiting him regularly, absorbing decades of weather knowledge that went well beyond what most people in the family bothered learning. Warning fatigue, Ferris had told him once, sitting on his porch watching a distant, unremarkable line of clouds. That's the real danger, more than the storms themselves half the time. People get so many false alarms they stop believing the real ones when they finally come. Your dad's not wrong that most warnings don't turn into much. He's wrong if he thinks that means none of them will. The trouble that eventually tested all of this began in early April, when Dawson noticed something in that spring's weather pattern that felt different from the usual run of warnings the family had grown accustomed to dismissing. It started small. A specific atmospheric setup that meteorological discussion forums Dawson had started following, at Ferris's suggestion, were flagging nearly a week in advance as having genuinely dangerous potential, a combination of instability, wind shear, and moisture convergence that experienced storm trackers took seriously in a way that felt distinctly different from the routine watches the family usually shrugged off. Dawson brought it up at dinner that week, the same way he'd brought up plenty of weather concerns before, mostly out of habit rather than real expectation his father would react differently this time. Every spring's got setups like this, Cole said, not unkindly, just with the particular weariness of a man who'd heard variations of this conversation many times before. Forecasters like to hype things up early. Half the time it amounts to nothing by the time it actually gets here. Dawson didn't argue. But that evening, he went back to Ferris's house, and the conversation that followed shifted something in him permanently. Your dad's probably right that most of these fizzle, Ferris told him, studying the same forecast discussion Dawson had shown him on his phone. But I've been watching weather a long time, longer than your dad's been alive, and I'll tell you honestly, this discussion reads different to me than the usual noise. Wind shear profile, the moisture they're tracking coming up from the Gulf, the timing lining up with peak afternoon heating, that's not automatically a monster storm. But it's the kind of setup that produces them when conditions align just wrong. I'm not telling you to panic. I'm telling you to actually watch this one closely yourself, instead of just trusting your dad's gut the way you usually do. Here's what Dawson began doing differently over the following 2 weeks, quietly, without making it a family argument he suspected he'd lose. He started tracking the developing pattern daily on his own, cross-referencing multiple forecast models the way Ferris had taught him, watching specifically for the specific combination of factors Ferris had flagged as genuinely dangerous rather than getting lulled by the general noise of routine spring watches. By the second week of April, 5 days out, the forecast had sharpened considerably, official meteorologists beginning to flag a specific date the following weekend as carrying serious tornado potential across a swath of central Oklahoma that included the Pruitt farm squarely within the highest risk zone. Dawson brought this to his father again, more directly this time, showing him the specific risk categorization. Cole looked at it, acknowledged it seriously enough to nod along, but his actual response remained cautious rather than fully convinced. We've had high-risk labels plenty of times that turned into a good soaking and not much else. I'm not going to reorganize the whole week over a forecast, even a scary-sounding one. We'll keep an eye on it close as it gets nearer. It was, in its way, not an unreasonable position from a man who'd lived through genuinely overhyped storms before. But Dawson, with Ferris's decades of accumulated instinct and increasingly specific technical concern backing his own growing certainty, made a decision that he kept mostly to himself over the following days. He started quietly preparing the storm cellar as though the worst-case scenario were actually going to happen, regardless of what his father ultimately decided to do about it. He cleared out years of accumulated junk from the underused cellar, old tools, broken equipment, boxes nobody had opened in years, over 2 afternoons after school, working mostly alone, telling Milo, when his younger brother asked what he was doing, only that he wanted the cellar cleaned up in case they ever needed it properly. He hauled down water, a battery-powered lantern to supplement the cellar's single-week overhead bulb, a first aid kit he assembled himself from supplies scattered around the house, and, at Ferris's specific suggestion during a phone call 3 days before the forecast date, a battery-powered weather radio purchased with his own saved money from a hardware store in town. Since the kitchen radio upstairs would be useless if the family actually needed to be sheltering rather than standing in the kitchen listening to it. Kayla noticed the preparations and asked him directly, with the particular skepticism 17-year-olds reserve for younger siblings' projects, whether he really thought this storm was going to be different from every other one that spring. I don't know for sure, Dawson told her honestly. But if I'm wrong, all this cost me is a couple afternoons of cleaning. If I'm right and I hadn't done it, that's a different kind of cost. By the day before the forecast date, the National Weather Service had escalated the outlook further, describing genuine concern for a significant tornado outbreak across the region, a level of warning language Dawson had learned, through 2 years of following Ferris's guidance, to take with real seriousness rather than routine dismissal. Cole, watching the same forecast that evening, finally acknowledged, at dinner, that this one looked more serious than most, agreeing that the family should keep the radio on and stay alert the following afternoon when the worst of the activity was expected. But his plan remained centered on watching the sky and reacting if things actually looked dangerous in the moment, the same practiced, feel-based approach he'd relied on his whole farming life, rather than treating the forecast-specific warnings as something requiring preemptive shelter before visible danger actually arrived. Dawson, listening to that plan, made his own quiet decision that evening. He would be in the cellar with time to spare, regardless of what the rest of the family chose to do, the moment conditions started matching what he and Ferris had been tracking for 2 weeks. The storm arrived the following afternoon almost exactly as the worst-case forecasts had projected, developing with a speed that caught even some professional forecasters slightly off guard, a supercell thunderstorm that intensified rapidly over the course of less than an hour, producing rotation that the National Weather Service upgraded to a tornado warning, not just a watch, an actual warning. meaning rotation had been confirmed, at 4:12 that afternoon. Dawson had been watching the sky from the porch for the previous 20 minutes, phone in hand, radar app open, watching the storm structure develop in exactly the pattern Ferris had once described to him as the kind that means business. The moment the warning came through on his phone, seconds before the county's outdoor sirens actually began sounding, Dawson was already moving. He found Milo first, grabbed his hand, and headed straight for the cellar without waiting for anyone's permission or agreement, calling back to his parents that the warning had actually been issued, real rotation confirmed, not just a watch anymore. Cole and Renata, hearing the genuine warning tone in Dawson's voice, something they hadn't heard from him before across 2 years of routine weather concerns, followed within minutes, Cole taking one last look at the darkening, oddly still sky before finally, fully, taking the threat as seriously as his son already had. The family was in the cellar, all 5 of them plus the dog, with the battery radio running and the door secured, for minutes before the tornado, an EF-2 that touched down briefly less than half a mile from the property, tracked across the northern edge of their land, tearing the roof entirely off an unused equipment shed and flattening a significant stretch of fence line before lifting again and dissipating less than 2 miles further on. The house itself, and everyone in it, came through untouched, sheltered in a cellar that had been stocked, cleaned, and ready 3 full days before anyone besides Dawson believed it would actually be needed. Cole walked the damaged property the next morning, comparing the flattened fence and roofless shed to what he heard, over the radio, had happened to several other farms in the county that hadn't taken shelter in time, and found Dawson already out checking on the cattle in the undamaged section of pasture, calm in a way that reflected 2 weeks of genuine, careful preparation rather than any last-minute panic. "How'd you know to be that ready?" Cole asked him. "Uncle Ferris taught me what to actually watch for," Dawson said. "I just believed him enough to act on it instead of just filing it away." Ferris, hearing the full account later that week, mostly just nodded slowly, the particular satisfaction of a man whose hard-earned knowledge had finally, fully proven itself useful to someone young enough to carry it forward. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Dawson hadn't set out to prove his father wrong about anything specific. He'd set out because an old man who'd survived one of the most powerful tornadoes ever recorded had told him something about that particular spring's pattern felt genuinely different, and Dawson had decided that trusting him was worth 2 afternoons of hauling water and cleaning out a cellar nobody else believed they'd actually need. Dawson is 15 now. He's already started tracking this spring's early forecast patterns with Ferris, the 2 of them sitting on the same porch most Sundays, the old man's instincts and the boy's growing technical fluency feeding into each other in a way that's become something closer to a genuine partnership than a mentorship now. Cole has started asking Dawson's opinion on severe weather forecasts before making his own calls, a shift neither of them has discussed directly but that shows up clearly enough in the small, practical ways it now happens: a battery radio permanently stocked in the cellar, a family plan reviewed each spring instead of assumed, a father who watches his son's phone screen now instead of only the sky. What's a warning someone in your life took seriously that everyone else nearly dismissed, right up until it mattered? Tell us in the comments, we read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.